Hey guys, today I want to do a reading of Francis Parker Yockey's essay, The Enemy of Europe and the Enemy of Our Enemies, from this 1981 edition by Liberty Bell Publications, annotated by Revilo P. Oliver. This book is available on Amazon and online, so if you're interested in what you hear today, you can find it and give the book a read. Ultimately, Yockey argues that it's better off for Western civilization to side with the Russians than the Americans because of the de facto position that America is outright controlled by international Jewry. And he believes that the Soviets and the Russians have somehow shaken off this influence. Now, I don't actually believe that to be the case, but nonetheless, this is a really interesting read, very relevant for today. And I'm going to focus on excerpts from the section of this essay called the Concert of Bolshevism, which is Yockey's term for the period between the Second and the coming Third World War, which is exactly where we are today. So let's begin. Quote, "Neither Russia nor America Jewry belongs to the Western civilization, though America, considered abstractly in and of itself as it was before the Revolution of 1933, is still a European colonial people." This is written back right before his death in 1960. So obviously America had a different culture and much different demographics in those days. So take that with an asterisk and think about our situation as white Americans today. Okay, quote, "Hence there is no cultural casus belli in the coming Third World War between these two powers. They both belong to the outer revolt against the world supremacy of the West, and the collective term for this revolt, which turns, destroying and negating against the creative affirmation of the Western destiny, is Bolshevism. Within the concert of Bolshevism, there are, of course, differences as well as similarities. Both must be evaluated. With both world powers, the reigning ideology comes from a bygone Western world outlook. The American ideology of freedom, equality, and legalism stems from 18th century Europe, as does its underlying philosophy of materialism. The Russian ideology of Marxism comes from 19th century English capitalism, of which Marxism is a supplement. In Russia, Marxism is treated as a religion, for the prime characteristic of the Russian soul is its religiosity. Whatever this soul takes seriously, be it even the absurd end product of Western materialism, Pavlovian reflexology, scientific psychology, it deals with in a religious way, that is, in a way transcending action. Nowhere in Russian life is there anything that in any way corresponds to the Marxist schema. The Russian soul is not yet politically mature, and Russia continues to use Marxism as a political export article, even though a market for it no longer exists. Since the First World War buried the form world, which is the ideal world, of the 19th century forever. American Jewry, which is similarly maladapted to the New Age, exports to Europe the shop-worn ideology of Montesquieu, Constant, Mill, Bentham, and hopes on this basis it could turn the destiny of Europe back 2 centuries. In America, on the other hand, Marxism is not a theory, but a fact. In the realm of facts, Marxism means class war. America is the classic land of finance capitalism, and trade unions, the two organized groups that systematically plunder the national economy. Not only Marx, but all 19th century theorizers were obsessed with economic doctrines: Malthus, Darwin, Mill, Spencer, Shaw. American life is essentially oriented to economics, and every aspect of life is simply referred for its justification thereto. So I'm going to interject here and share a couple of thoughts, keep it simple. Yockey highlights Russia's natural religiosity. In my interpretation, I think this is why we have seen the Bolsheviks in Russia rebrand into this traditionalist model to better appeal to the religious instincts of the Russian people and to rebuild Bolshevism under the guise of religion, Christianity and to use Christianity and traditional values as a political weapon that appeal to the morally bankrupt, degraded populations of the West, but are really just the justification for hard political, real political, power political action against the West. And so I think we see this playing out today, and what we see with the fourth political theory, Eurasianism, and Russian Bolshevism is just effectively the fourth international, a rebranded, reworked form of Marxism, of Bolshevism, to basically promote Russian Eurasian imperialism. And on the other side, we see that Yockey is criticizing America in terms of the basis of American life being fundamentally materialistic, where the dollar is God, where money is the central organizing principle of all life. And anybody could notice this in American society. It sort of speaks for itself. And for this reason, he actually thinks that orthodox Marxist thinking is more appropriate in America than it is Russia. And that's why I think we see Marxism today emerging in the United States and taking root through its cultural and hard forms. So let's continue. Quote, feminine matriarchal life is routine. Hence, American life is routine and technicized. Books instruct the population how to win friends, how social life, family life, sexual life are to be conducted. Yet this uniformization of life is not perceived as burdensome or ignominious. The American population is entirely passive and feels quite at home in this atmosphere of a nursery. The social instincts predominate over the individual instincts, and every American child is taught from his earliest days that the essence of leading a successful life consists in getting along with people. There is no other way to realize this ideal than to renounce one's individuality. That is the explanation for the difficulty of kindling any kind of political opposition in America. As soon as a policy secures a foothold and becomes popular, it is right and respectable. Radical or persistent criticism is impossible in America. The term individualist is nearly an insult. The extirpation of strong individuality precludes the rise of a true elite, an aristocracy, a ruling stratum, for these are always based upon strong individuality and the feeling of uniqueness. All feelings of superiority, of higher self-esteem, of uniqueness are educated out of the American while he is still in kindergarten. It is impressed upon him that his existence, his problems are exactly like those of everybody else. Okay, so my take on this is pretty straightforward. Americans tend to pride themselves on the spirit of rugged individualism and this frontier mindset that sort of built and founded the country and was part of the colonial identity of America. But by the time we get to the late 19th and early 20th century and the Industrial Revolution, this is all being rapidly bred out of Americans, and we're dealing with a scientific approach to organizing society, mass production, standardization, box homes and developments, and really the cult of the market economy. And that natural rough and tumble frontier mentality is pretty much subverted, except for in little pockets in traditional areas of America. And for this reason, we need to praise America for what it is, not what it once was or we hope it should be. And we have to realize that American life is dominated by money, materialism, comfort, techniques, and just getting along. And it's no secret. Just look at Americans. They dress the same, shop at Walmart, consume the same media. It's a culture of mass production where we have been socially engineered, culturally engineered in a mass way, and have lost any sort of cultural nuance and individuality. And all terms of greatness is just associated with economic performance rather than something that has to do with true culture, individualism, or identity. Okay, let's continue. An elementary demand of life, however, is that every group possesses a stratified social articulation. America's elite for economic, technical, industrial, social purposes is the business class, those 30,000 technical managerial brains that permit American life to function. For political purposes, the elite is the Jewish entity, which enjoys a monopoly of power in all matters, but is especially conspicuous in the direction of foreign affairs. The technical managerial caste has no sense of carrying out a mission. It does not regard itself as superior in nature, but only as a more proficient in intellectual technical matters. This type of social technical differentiation resembles that which exists among the social insects, for example, the bees and the ants. Well, obviously, we can witness this right in front of our faces today, so I don't really need to say much here. He goes on and he criticizes Russian life. I'm not going to read the next paragraph, but he talks about how Russian life is fundamentally barbarian. It's a weaker culture. It's not as advanced, but that it holds some potential, and that Marxism is effectively alien to the Russian life form. And that is exactly why Bolshevism has had to reconstitute itself in Russia, as we're seeing today. Okay, next paragraph, quote, America's ideology, 18th century materialistic egalitarianism and 19th century capitalism, and Russia's ideology, 19th century proletarian capitalism, are both permeated with the spirit of their respective populations. The American ideology with that of the amalgam of Negro, Jewish, Asiatic, Indian, European elements as modified by the peculiarities of the landscape. The Russian ideology with that of the nomadic tribes of Asia, which are imbued with the enormous impersonality of the Asiatic steppes. The culture man, outside of the culture sphere, stands in danger of losing his cultural orientation, what the British civil administration in India used to call going negative. During the expansion of the American population over the vast plains, the American colonial lost well nigh every contact with Western tradition and Western happenings, and his Western culture was diluted. Only in one part of Chinese or Hindu he would have retained his cultural orientation in fullest measure, for conflict with the alien strengthens the proper. But he fought merely savages, and more often the landscape itself, the hardships of nature. In the inward contest between culture and landscape, landscape was largely the victor. So I'll interject here. This is kind of getting to the mindset of this frontier mentality, frontier barbarism that some people are celebrating now on Twitter and think is the key. But if you have any degree of sophistication in your ideas and historical awareness, you'll realize that this type of cultural alienation is not a strength, it's a weakness. Our strength is our historical, cultural understanding of ourselves and embracing that deeper Western identity. Otherwise, we are more easily imposed upon on the mental level. The mental level is more significant than the physical level. The inward contest between culture and landscape is largely the victor because comfort is one of the main ideals of the American. His vital impetus finds expression primarily in the domain of technics. So the American is always trying to invent new equipment to make life more convenient. Technical processes are used to make life easier and more convenient. This is such a deep thread of American culture. Everyone loves the latest gadget to make something easier. Totally disgusting. Okay, quote, unrestrained by tradition, by political or social considerations, he fell head over heels into absolute technical development, and in technics he made his the foremost among the Western colonies. Thus, as a result of his century of stateless expansion, the American succumbed on the one hand to the primitivity of his vast and empty continent, while, as the result of the concentration made possible for him by the absence of power struggles, on the other hand, he made himself in some respect superior to Europeans. This had as its consequence yet another peculiarity. So he's saying because of the absence of cultural struggle and being up against developed cultural adversaries, America never truly formed a state and a coherent culture, lost its identity out on the frontier, and the identity became based on a struggle against nature, which lent itself to techniques, and from developing techniques in such an advanced way, began to feel itself superior to Europe, and from that began to divide itself from Europe in a way that was detrimental to the whole of the race. The simultaneous presence of primitivity and over-civilization in the American shaped his relationship to Europe into an unhealthy one. With his strong technical aptitude, he came to regard Europe as inferior. With his primitivity, he failed to comprehend Europe's cultural imperative in the 20th century. Hence, he offered no resistance when the culture-distorting regime, i.e. the Jews, foisted on America the idea that it had to educate Europe. This idea could be all the more inculcated since America is by nature feminine, matriarchal, and attributes great value to formal education. In America, the autodidact will find neither political, academic, professional, nor social recognition. This peculiarity of the American character has been aggravated by the culture-distorting element, and American schools and universities have been made into scholastic factories that produce uniform biological units. They have eradicated human individuality so far as they can be attained at all in the human species. All values imparted through this education, such as comfort, security, and social uniformity, may be found on the purely animal level in man. None appeal to the specifically human level, which is embodied at highest potential by the unique and individualized human being with his loftier values. And we see this today in universities where students are effectively not being educated to be critical and independent thinkers, not being educated in terms of their physical, mental, emotional health, and character development, but are simply being trained to be corporate worker bees that can readily assimilate to the corporate work environment, which today is all about multiculturalism and getting along. So again, this is about the standardization of culture, which is the disease that we're fighting. Okay, quote, "While the American is a culture man, re-primitivized on the one side of his being and over-civilized on the other, since he is completely and entirely animated by the ideals of peace, comfort, and security, the Russian is a barbarian and still wholly primitive. Centuries of Petronism, meaning Peter the Great, and the ideas of Western civilization that came through Peter and Catherine, never touched the underground Russian. No matter what it figured as such for centuries, Russia never became a nation of the West. Just ask Alexander Dugin, he'll tell you the same thing about the struggle between the East and West in the Russian psyche, and they're choosing East, very clear. They are an anti-Western force. And back to the text, America is a genuine Western colony, though, to be sure. It must now be counted part of the outer revolt. So he's saying that America is effectively spiritually and ontologically Western, but it has been corrupted because of its context, effectively, and being too far removed from other developed cultures and struggle, which I think is changing now through multiculturalism. White Americans are realizing this at different rates, and that's why there's so much chaos, because we're finally looking in the mirror and saying, who are we really? Is our identity deeper than just being American? Is there something deeper, more fundamental, more spiritual, more ancient? And that's where the racial identity comes in. And then he's highlighting that, Russia is definitely not Western. They are not part of Western civilization. They really have never been, except for some aristocratic elites in the past few hundred years. Okay, quote, "The orientation towards technics is common to both. America is technical by instinct. Russia has become so under compulsion from its leaders, who have only politico-military reasons for embracing techniques. In the field of philosophy, America's sole contribution to the Western intellectual heritage was pragmatism, the doctrine that truth is, quote, what works. In other words, truth is not a function of the soul, but of nature. Pragmatism is at once a primitive and over-civilized philosophy, primitive because its position vis-a-vis truth is devoid of higher culture, over-civilized because it makes all truth merely an attribute of technics. Expressed in the terms of American psychology, quote, true is what procures me more security, more comfort, end quote. In America, obsession with techniques is the expression and content of life of the population. It is instinctive, and America naturally seeks to export it to whatever countries its armies and bomber squadrons have conquered. In Russia, on the other hand, the technic's obsession merely serves political and military ends and is imposed on the Russian population only through the apparatus of a political dictatorship. Even though the Soviet Union is apparently gone, obviously this is still going on with Putin. And then finally, the Russian experiences things primarily in a religious way, hence the incredible spectacle of his worshipping a machine. All right. Russia exhibits the same education obsession as America. In the words of Lunacharsky, quote, education distributed according to Marxist principles can make even the most mediocre Oriental intelligent. Once again, a common denominator with America. Okay, there too, intelligence is regarded as something that can be acquired and moreover as the only distinction between human beings. Both Russia and America hold that the external forms and conditions of the mind. Both Russia and America hold that the external forms and conditions the mind. So the whole idea here is the truth has to do with conditioning, with nurture over nature, with using technical processes to engineer culture, to engineer social psychology, and trying to impose an order upon these vast, diverse populations on a continental level in a centralized way. And in this sense, there's not too much of a difference between American and Russian life. And both of these paradigms are anathema to Western civilization and the spirit of Europe and Aryan mankind. So I'm reading this, obviously, because I want to draw parallels to today. The same things remain true. This is why we see so many aspects of the American right identifying with Russia, because they are these mass-produced culturalist beings that don't understand the real meaning of Western heritage. And that is our goal, to awaken the racial soul so we can strive towards something better and a higher ideal, a higher quality. Both Russia and America emphasize totally environment and experience, negate dogmatically spirit and soul. For both the collective man is the ideal and the prevalent type. In both there naturally exists the most extreme intolerance towards anything other than the mass ideal. So an interesting note here would be that the religiosity of Russia, and just religiosity in general, is just a feature of this mass mind orientation, devoid of nuance and quality. It's just, again, applying a one-size-fits-all hive mind mentality to culture that lacks true nuance and quality. And whether it's happening through a religious program or a technocratic state-run program, it really makes little difference. It's still cultureless within Yockey's framework. Okay, quote, in Russia, the craze for uniformity, including the education mania, is likewise imposed from above to carry out a political program. The emphasis on the power of environment, the adoration of a reflexology, the idealization of machines, of statistics and percentages, and of economic theories generally, all this in Russia simply technique, and it is all essentially negative. The Russian peasant barbarian soul is a religious ferment, and as such abhors economic theories, machines, science, and nationalism. The program of Moscow Bolshevism represents a means of quashing the hyper-individuality of the people of Pugachevs, Askakovs, Kropotkins, Nechayevs, Dostoevskys, Rasputins, and Shopskys. Primarily, Moscow Bolshevism is a method for politicizing the religious barbarian Russia. Boy, we could read that again thinking of Alexander Dugin and Russia today. Primarily, Moscow Bolshevism is a method for politicizing the religious barbarian Russia. This is all the propaganda coming from the Kremlin. And he's trying to appeal to that base American instinct as well. That the Moscow regime uses Marxism as an export article is simply political idiocy, and the possibility constantly exists that it will one day discard it because of its ineffectiveness. That line is huge, so insightful, and that's exactly what happened. That's what perestroika was. That's what the end of the Soviet Union was. This world Bolshevik project had to reorganize, regroup, reformulate because it realized the Marxist doctrine couldn't get the third world. It couldn't get the developing world that was just too traditional. And if they wanted to bring down the West, if they wanted to bring down Aryan civilization, they had to regroup and really create a platform that could include Islam, could include the so-called peoples of tradition, meaning all the people outside of the Western world, to unify them in a giant block that would serve as the hammer to crush the decadent West that became so decadent and corrupted because of the Jewish Bolshevik infiltration within the West. So it's really two arms, the left and the right, working to the same world Bolshevik goal. That's the point I'm trying to make with reading this. Quote, "For Europe, the following distinction is important. American Jewish Bolshevism is the instinctive destruction of the West through primitive anti-cultural ideas, peace, comfort, security, abolition of individuality, through over-technicization, through the imposition of culture distortion and culture retardation, i.e. woke. Russian Bolshevism seeks to attain the destruction of the West in the spirit of pan-Slavic religiosity, i.e. the Russification of all humanity." Exactly what I was just getting to. You know, it's two arms working together, the left and the right. Thus, American Jewish Bolshevism poses a real spiritual threat to Europe. In its every aspect, American Jewish Bolshevism strikes a weak spot in the European organism. Even in Europe, there exists a stratum, the Michel stratum, the inner America, which is animated by a purely animal American ideal of peace, comfort, security, abolition of individuality. Even in Europe, there is an element that would like to replace culture with machinery. Even on Europe, culture retarding regimes can be imposed, if necessary, with American bayonets. Even in Europe, culture distortion is present, the dictature over Europe of the American Jewish symbiosis itself. And even in Europe, in the midst of the age of absolute politics, the Cato type exists. You can watch him babbling, misty-eyed, about democratic ideals, while the barbarian and the distorter occupy the sacred soil of the West. The 20th century European Cato would rather see the West destroyed than have finally to toss the rubbish of democratic ideals on the scrap heap of history, where the corpse of democracy lies stinking in the putrescent half of a century of decay. And the putrescent after a half century of decay. Russian Bolshevism is simply barbarism, and therefore finds no resonance anywhere in Europe. Even Europe's lowest spiritual stratum, the inner trader, the Michel stratum, i.e. the liberal, has nothing whatever in common with the pan-Slavism of barbaric population streams. Russian religiosity has been temporarily, and from a cultural standpoint, falsely raised to political intensity as a reflex of the great Western spiritual development, the resurgence of authority, the genesis of the Imperium idea. Without the Western culture, there would be no such structure as Russia, only marauding tribes of barbaric horsemen like the Cossack in Taras Bulba. So Yockey's getting at the fact that the West is stuck between these two pincers. Europe is stuck between these two pincers of America and Russia, both being manipulated by these foreign Jewish forces, and they're working to undermine the destiny of the West, which he just identifies as the spirit of authority, the spirit of absolute politics, which is this idea of a new imperium, sort of following in the destiny of the Holy Roman Empire and the Caesars. Okay, quote, "Russian Bolshevism is therefore less dangerous to Europe than American Jewish Bolshevism, for no aspect of its menace corresponds to a weakness in Europe's spiritual armor. Europe actually has an inner America. However, Europe has no inner Russia. Obviously, the so-called communist parties are not at all reliable tools wherewith a Russian occupation of Europe could be built. In fact, the work of these communist parties is already done. They were useful instruments of early Bolshevism's foreign policy, especially in the period of 1933 to 39. During the Second World War, they helped save Russia's existence as a political unit. After the war, they helped create the Russian power accumulation extending from Hanover to Hong Kong, the largest continuous power accumulation in the history of the world. Yet today, between the Second and Third World Wars, all communist parties, including the American, are politically insignificant. That's something to keep in mind. He's saying orthodox communist parties are politically irrelevant, but he's also calling this period that we're in the Concert of Bolshevism, meaning that Bolshevism is more than communism. It's not just Marxism, it's this force that effectively wants to destroy Western civilization and to replace it with a new idea, which is effectively globalism. The communist parties of the West are simply class war units, not bearers of barbarism and Russian pan-Slav nationalism. In the 20th century, all are forced to think in terms of facts and not merely words, so far as politics is concerned, and Russia's connection with Western class war rests simply on words. Russia claims to be the bearer of class war in the West. Nevertheless, during the Second World War, the Moscow regime forbade the American Communist Party to engage in class warfare. Actually, the entire policy of using Marxism as a political export article is now political stupidity, where Marxism has lost its former rabble-rousing value in the West. The high point of class war in the West has passed. And instead of class war, we're seeing the cultural Marxism, the cultural retardation, and that's really being amplified through the American Bolshevik leadership. Okay. In particular, it was the reorientation of Russian world policy after the Second World War, the turning against the Jewish entity of church, state, nation, people, race, that sealed the doom of every communist party in the West, the one in America included. So from here on out, for the rest of this essay, Yockey turns to discuss the fact that he thinks Russia is less of a threat to Western civilization because it, quote, doesn't correspond to the inner weaknesses of Europe in the way that the American ideology does. And for this reason, it would be better to work with the Russians rather than the Americans because Russians are identified as an other to the European. In other words, Europe recognizes that Russia is not part of its civilization. And because it is such a clearly defined other, it poses less of a threat than this inner infiltration. In other words, Yockey takes the position that the inner enemy is more dangerous than the outer enemy. Of course, this is no longer the case if that outer enemy is waging physical war against you, a possibility which Yockey discusses, and he says Europe will effectively unify and rise up against Russia, and any sort of Russian invasion will serve to unify Europe. And that is why Russia is less of an enemy, because it can only make Europe stronger. And that is exactly what is happening today. That's what we are witnessing. Because of Russian aggression, Europe is consolidating and moving towards its united imperial destiny. And that is something that we need to encourage and embrace, because it is through a unified Europe that this high destiny of the West will be reached. And that is the destiny of all Aryan people in all of the colonies of Europe, all of the colonial cultures, whether that's Australia, New Zealand, small remnant that's left in South Africa, whatever's left in the United States of culturally and racially conscious whites, and of course Canada, and any other neo-European society. We are all part of a greater historic Western civilization of common race, heritage, and values. And through this schizophrenic and very difficult time of this concert of Bolshevism, where both of the big power blocks on the earth are hostile to our interests, we are being forced to redefine ourselves. And that is happening now, slowly but surely, through the mass racial awakening that's going on and through the political events going on in Europe. So I'm going to stop now. I'm going to wrap this up. I think that kind of articulates the point of describing the nature of this concert of Bolshevism and gives some deeper context about the nature of this Third World War and what it's really about. and hopefully suggests what we can actually do to move forward. And fundamentally, that is a cultural, an ontological, a spiritual shift to embrace our collective Western identity and heritage. And that is going to count for a lot more than trying to choose between the lesser of evils and side with either the American Bolsheviks or the Russian Bolsheviks. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please follow me on Twitter at Aryan Apotheosis. The account name is Phoenix Apotheosis. I'm also on Telegram by the same name. Thank you. Catch you next time.